Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss 9/11. And just 2 days ago, in fact, was 9/11's 18th anniversary. And now in these 18 years since those attacks took place in New York and in other places across the United States, such as at the Pentagon and otherwise, in Pennsylvania as well, a lot has happened, hasn't it? And the war on terror was waged and started, in fact, by George W. Bush, at that time the U.S. president. What has occurred vis-a-vis human rights? Are we now all more secure in today's world? Have our human rights around the world improved? Has the safety, in fact, even of just the U.S. homeland improved? What of the human rights of just Americans themselves? The right to privacy, the right to free speech, et cetera, et cetera. And what of then the many wars the U.S. has waged ever since 9/11, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Iraq, or otherwise, really around the world? Has any of that helped the cause that the U.S. said it was going to fight after the 9/11 attacks? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Jeremy Bioletti, who is a human rights barrister with Jeremy Bioletti Law. He's joining us now from Auckland in New Zealand. We're also joined by Robert G. Patman, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Otago. He's joining us now from Dunedin in New Zealand as well. Robert and Jeremy, thank you both for your time this evening. Robert, I'd like to start with you. How do you reflect on these years since 9/11 and what's occurred around the world vis-a-vis the war on terror?
Well, I think the consequences, both short-term and long-term, have been disquieting, actually. I think one of the problems after 9/11 was the actual term war on terror. I think the United States did not specifically target the people who were responsible for 9/11. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and by declaring war on terror, it seemed to me that that was an expansive slogan which facilitated taking the struggle against terrorism beyond the culprits. For example, the United States found itself invading Iraq. It defied the UN Security Council. And that set in train the invasion of Iraq. Far from weakening Al-Qaeda, actually gave it a foothold in a country where it had never previously been. And I think we've seen the long-term consequences. You could argue that the invasion of Iraq set in train a set of consequences: the disbanding of the Iraqi army following the American invasion, and the setting up by Sunni supremacists in Iraq a small group who became Islamic State with the Syrian civil war. So we've seen some far-reaching consequences. And you could say that the war on terror also had grave effects on the global economy. Mr. Bush fought a war, two wars on the credit card, and that culminated and contributed to the financial crisis.
Indeed. Jeremy, I wonder where your thoughts are on that. You're a human rights expert as well and a human rights barrister. So from that point of view also, this has been pretty detrimental around the world, hasn't it? And I was just looking at estimates from the Watson Institute of International Affairs at the Brown University. A November 2018 estimate of that institute says that at least upwards of 507,000 people have just been killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and here in Pakistan ever since the war on terror began. And that does not even include the many deaths that have occurred in Syria. And that, it admits, is a low estimate in all regards. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you have the entry into the Iraq War. You have the situation with Tony Blair in the UK, the weapons of mass destruction. You've got all of that happening. You've got the situation in Syria. Which side is ISIS on there, and who's backing them? The whole situation from my viewpoint in New Zealand, which I have to concede is a long-distance detached one, the whole situation is just so confusing as to exactly what's going on. And I agree with Robert. The whole concept of it is pretty nebulous and seems to just reach to wherever people want to reach. There doesn't seem to be any sort of underlying logic to what's occurred. It's just gone from one crisis to the next. And, even now, the Iraq war, the situation in Yemen, it's just ongoing.
Yeah.
But from a New Zealand point of view, we've seen the spread of terror legislation. We had to change all our terrorism legislation in New Zealand. So it's really been a huge impact. Impact.
Indeed. So then I wonder, Robert, then, when it comes to all of the above, those who waged those wars, those who went into Iraq, I mean, even the likes of Tony Blair, as you well know, Robert, have justified it, saying that Saddam needed to be removed, et cetera, et cetera. Even when it comes to Afghanistan, obviously, there are many concerns about the human rights violations that have occurred under the coalition forces' activities in that country. And just the fact that all these years later, in fact, now America is trying to come to some sort of a peace deal with the very group which it claimed it essentially went in to fight against at some level. What do you make of that entire situation? It's sort of, again, proof, isn't it, that this war on terror has failed?
Well, I think I think when we talk about the struggle against terrorism, it's gone through various forms. Under Mr. Bush, it was called the War on Terror. Under Mr. Obama, it became the campaign against violent extremism. Mr. Obama tried to rebuild America's reputation in the Islamic world. He didn't really succeed, not least because he faced a lot of resistance in the United States. There were calls, for example, for America to intervene in Syria, which he resisted largely. So he had a bit of a problem there. And also, I think Mr. Obama wasn't able to live up to expectations with regard to issues which people expected action on. Early in his administration, he made significant speeches in Cairo and Istanbul. And I think many people in the Islamic world, not least the Middle East, were expecting action on the Palestinian issue. But I'm afraid politics got in the way there to some degree. The sort of pro-Israeli lobby in the United States sent a pretty strong message to Mr. Obama, and I think he backed off because he was quite concerned about not getting re-elected in 2012. And then, of course, we've had Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump has declared a struggle against what he calls radical Islamic terror. And this, if Mr. Bush, if Mr. Bush stigmatized them, I think it's fair to say, because after all, it's Mr. Bush who said you're either with us or against us. But I think Mr. Trump's gone much further with his ban on Muslims from terror-prone areas. And in a sense, it's sad when you think after 18 years, why do countries defend themselves against terrorism? It's to uphold the rule of law and human rights. Exactly. And yet some of those things, those very things, have been downgraded in the name of national security or international security. And
that leads me very, very well to my question to Jeremy. If you allow me, Robert, I just want to ask that very question to Jeremy, in fact, that you just, the line you just said there, I mean, on this issue of human rights and upholding rule of law, that seems to have just gone out the window, right? Like the moment the attacks occurred in 9/11, and obviously no one is justifying those attacks at any level, but in the aftermath, it seemed that the U.S. Just presumed that it could do as it so wished, as be it vengeance or whatever in the aftermath. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, exactly. I mean, you've got Guantanamo Bay, the situation there. You had renditions occurring to black spots all around the world. You had military law in the United States operating in relation to the people that were captured. So you had this whole parallel universe of supposed judicial happenings, which were just completely outside anything anyone had ever experienced before.
And in your expert opinion, as an expert of law, Jeremy, I wonder, is there any loophole in any international law to allow for any of the above, such as you said, Guantanamo? We can also talk about Abu Ghraib and other such occurrences.
Well, I mean, in the USA, they had their Justice Department look at the situation and express legal opinions that they could do what they were doing and that it was legal. But, I mean, that applies in any situation. A government can always find a legality in what they're doing, one way or the other. So, but it has a flow-on effect in terms of the rule of law, because, you know, other countries look at it and think, well, you know, can they do the same thing? It had a sort of a flow-on effect into New Zealand in a much less dramatic way, where you know, terror legislation that was enacted was used for, you know, domestic reasons. You had spying on domestic citizens in New Zealand. So it really has changed, in my view, it just changed the whole landscape.
Robert, I wonder what you think are the consequences of all of the above, because then if it's a world where it's a free-for-all, essentially, when it comes to the U.S. and how it wants to act out against terrorism or against wherever it feels there is a threat to its national security, whether legitimate or otherwise, what is that then? What kind of a precedent does that set then? Because again, as Jeremy there said, some other actors or other countries around the world would then look at that and say, well, what does that mean for us?
I think Jeremy's raised a very good point. And I think the problem is that the United States, as well as other great powers, have to recognize that problems like transnational terrorism, problems such as the global economy, problems such as environmental problems, they cannot be solved unilaterally. They have to be solved internationally. And quite frankly, the sort of security problems raised by 9/11 always needed a multilateral response. And they needed a response, not just with the symptoms of the problem, but the actual causes. And I think, in a sense, since 9/11, there's been a tremendous focus on the manifestations of the symptoms of the problem, whether it be Al-Qaeda emerging or it be the emergence of Islamic State. But there's been less attention on some of the underlying grievances which these terror groups exploit, the continuing perception of injustice in the Middle East, not least over the Palestinian situation. I know that these terror groups are not interested in the plight of the Palestinians, but it is an issue that causes anger, and that anger is which they are able to exploit that.
And I wonder, Robert, if you think, just as a final thought, if you think that this almost obsession with the Middle East and the Islamic world has sort of then deflected and distracted from other issues that have now come up all these years later, such as far-right extremism, etc.
Yes, it's generated Islamophobia. And Islamophobia, after 9/11, unfortunately, has to some extent contributed to violent white nationalism. As you're probably aware, Christchurch experienced that in New Zealand not so long ago. But this is an international problem. And a number of countries, including the United States, have experienced this white supremacist violence. And so this is a major problem. We often talk about Islamist terrorism, but there's also white nationalist terrorism. And we do need to address some of the problems which are causing the grievances which these extremists feed off. And that's, of course, there's a long list of issues that need to be sorted. We need to make the world economy work better for more people. That's a big issue that faces us.
Indeed. We'll leave there as a final thought. I know we've just touched the iceberg when it comes to this issue, gentlemen, but we appreciate both your time and, of course, your insight. That was Jeremy and Robert, both of them speaking to us from New Zealand this evening there. An important issue, obviously, to look back at the legacy of 9/11 since those attacks occurred in New York, Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon there in D.C. The U.S. went gung-ho forward in wars in Afghanistan and then Iraq specifically, on false premises of WMDs. We know that those WMDs were never really found, and we all remember Colin Powell sitting at the UN Security Council showing quote-unquote proof that Saddam Hussein at that time had WMDs, again, never found. And then, of course, other wars, which the U.S. is implicitly or indirectly involved in places like Syria. And just the whole Israel-Palestine issue and giving Israel carte blanche, creating more and more resentment towards the United States, and just creating havoc when it comes to human rights and international law around the world vis-a-vis Guantanamo Bay and black prisons throughout the world where torture takes place under the guise of the United States, which claims, again, it is the moral authority of the world. So again, since 9/11, no one has really become any safer, and that countless, several-fold more lives have been lost in this war on terror, which has certainly not succeeded if we look at the numbers and we look at the situation we all around the world find ourselves in now. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned with us. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. In today's final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss UN investigators releasing a report about how airstrikes by U.S.-led coalition forces in Syria have killed or wounded many civilians, indicating that the required precautions were ignored and war crimes may have been committed. But it didn't just go after the U.S.-led coalition. It also spoke about Syrian government and allied Russian warplanes also conducting a deadly campaign that targeted, in their opinion, medical facilities, schools, markets, and farmland, which also may amount to war crimes. And then finally, there was also mention of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as the Al-Nusra Front, which is the dominant terror group or armed group in Idlib, which fired rockets and has fired rockets indiscriminately and has killed civilians as well, also possibly war crimes. So essentially, this report by the UN investigators painting a pretty dim picture for all parties involved in Syria at this time, including the sitting government and all external players. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Ms. Diane Dark, who is an author. She's a Syria specialist and Middle East cultural expert, and she's the author of several books on Middle East society, including My House in Damascus, The Merchant of Syria, and is co-author of The Last Sanctuary in Aleppo. She's joining us now from Kent in the United Kingdom. Diana, thank you for your time this morning. What are your thoughts about this report? I imagine at some level it's not a complete surprise, is it, that all the players in Syria have dirty hands?
No, but it's unfortunate to my mind because, of course, the headline that people take away from it is that everybody is equal in this war. Because, I mean, tragically, 25% of people in the UK assume that there is, in fact, no longer even a war going on, according to some YouGov recent poll. And a headline like this makes everybody think, oh, everybody is equally guilty, which, of course, is, there is no moral equivalence in this war. We have to understand that 95% of the casualties have been caused by the Assad government, supported by the Russians, by Iran, Iranian militias, and by Hezbollah. So, yes, of course, there have been casualties in the bombing campaign that the US did around Raqqa. But to put it in the same context as what the Syrian government has been doing to its own people for the last 8 years is just, I think, unfortunate. I'm afraid the UN, in my mind, doesn't come out of the Syria conflict well at all. They've pulled out. They pulled the plug on it. Assad knows that they're weak.
But Diana, if I may play devil's advocate for a moment, you know what the argument on the other side is, that all these external players came in and made the situation that much worse, therefore requiring the government forces as well as the government's allied governments, such as Russia and Iran, as you mentioned, to get involved, to be invited in, that's what the government says, the Assad government, to be able to fight all these different as they would term, militant/terrorist groups, such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or the many others. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think that is allowing Assad to seize the narrative because, and he's done it very effectively. You have to give him credit for that. He's managed to push himself into the forefront. And again, it's a sort of irony that he's had training in all of this from British and American PR companies. So he knows how to push his own narrative and to paint himself in this sort of saintly light as the person fighting terrorism when, anybody who's followed this conflict closely and who knew Syria before the war knows full well that Assad himself has escalated this, what began as a peaceful uprising into the most tragic situation where 500,000 people are dead. And there he is presenting himself as the victor. It is astonishing to my mind that the international community allows him to get away with this. And I wish the UN would have some mechanism of, putting it in context and saying that, giving the figures, actually saying, look, 95% of the casualties have been caused by Assad. So, I mean, actually, ISIS, which of course was our focus in the West all along, the number of casualties that ISIS created was 1%, tiny numbers. And yet all our media focus was on ISIS because we thought, well, ISIS is the thing that affects us over here. What we don't understand, it seems, is that, what stays in Syria, what starts in Syria, what's going on there is not going to stay there. Unfortunately, this is going to create, the perfect environment for more extremist terrorism to develop, because of the fact that, the bad guy, if you like, the dictator, has won. And I mean, how are ordinary people going to respond to that? It's so tragic.
Indeed, and I wonder then what you think will happen next, because as you there said, for some people, the narrative now is that essentially Assad has come out on top. However, of course, we can talk about the north and on certain regions in Syria right now, which may be under a Turkish/American control, or even just Idlib, which is basically under control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it can be argued. What do you think will happen next? Will Assad gain the upper hand throughout the country, or will this remain essentially a stalemate situation? Because I've always wondered that specifically, even when it comes to Idlib, that can't just foster and remain as is. Something needs to happen.
Yeah, and of course he knows again that the timing is right for him now. When he is perceived to have won, the UN has pulled out of Idlib. A lot of funding, of international funding in Idlib for the hospitals, the schools, has also, had the plug pulled on it. So of course, the so-called rebels in Idlib are getting weaker. And I mean, not to paint Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as some sort of, crusading force. Obviously, they're not. They have seized. But again, they're a small minority. That's the tragic situation, and they've been allowed to sort of present. Well, Assad has been able to present them as the people he's fighting. Where again, you've only got to follow it to see how they're not the people he's targeting. Recently on the BBC, Quentin Somerville was in Idlib, filming a hospital that had just been targeted in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was a very precise attack on a hospital in the middle of nowhere. How can they maintain that is, a military target? So it is tragic.
Indeed. We'll leave it there as our final word, Diana, but of course, we appreciate your time this morning speaking to us there from Kent. That was Diana Dark, who's an author and Syria specialist and Middle East cultural expert as well, sharing her thoughts with us on this important topic of these war crimes. And, as Diana there said and argued, is it fair to put all players in Syria on the same exact level? Does the government now bear more responsibility in this regard? Obviously, the other side, as I'd put to Diana as well, would argue no. But obviously, as Diana also passionately argued, the government does, when it comes to statistics, does hold more responsibility for what is occurring vis-a-vis any human rights crimes or war crimes and the killing of civilians around the country, etc. Certainly a stalemate situation, though, when it comes to places like Idlib and otherwise. So will Assad get the upper hand throughout the country? Will the Americans, will the Turks, will Idlib's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and others allow for that to occur, as well as the other parties, mind you, in this entire mess? We'll have to wait and see how that plays out in the coming days. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.